Greetings. In this segment, we're going to continue considering the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, and I want to now focus in on the thread of kingship in the two books. And so we'll review very quickly some of the things we've covered in the other videos. So I'd like to begin with looking at 1 Samuel 8, which is the chapter in which the people actually asked for a king. And this is a very famous chapter. If you had any background in the church, Sunday school, teaching, or whatever, certainly I did. And I learned that God's ideal from the beginning was that there should be never should be a king in Israel. And that when Israel asked for a king, 1 Samuel 8, this is a sinful request, and it was rejecting the Lord as their king. And God granted that, not because he really wanted to, but it was kind of a second best grudging concession to their sinful nature. The analogy sometimes is made with the granting of divorce in Deuteronomy. God's plan was that there should never be a divorce, of course, and yet he allowed in certain circumstances for that to happen. But those are certainly different cases, and the Bible doesn't develop the idea of divorce as a great thing, but the Bible does develop the idea of the kingship and ultimately leading to the great king, capital K, the Messiah in the New Testament. So this is the pivotal chapter. And as we've seen in the different other video, you have Samuel, verses 1 to 3, being old, and his sons are not walking in his ways. So the response, verses 4 and 5, of the elders is to come to Samuel and say, give us a king to judge us. And the word judge there is echoing back in the book of Judges, what they were to do. And the main function of the judges was not just a juridical function. It was not like a Judge Judy or something on TV. But the main function when a judge was raised up, it was to respond to some sort of military threat to Israel or some sort of subjection. So that here they're asking for a king to do what the judges had done, which is to be essentially their great warrior. And if you remember the passage in Deuteronomy 17, where the king is not to multiply horses or wives or riches, not to make alliances with Egypt, this flies in the face of that. So they're asking for a king like the nations, and the predominant view in the nations is of a great warrior. So all of those things kind of come together here, and we should not be surprised then to see that Samuel feels angry, and God says, don't worry, it's not you that they're rejecting me as king. And the rejection is, and the problem here is not the fact that they asked for a king. Rather, the problem is what kind of king they were asking for. God, from the very beginning, has signaled that he wanted to establish kingship from the lines of Abraham and his descendants. But it was to be a radically countercultural kind of a king. It was a king who was to be rooted in Torah, rooted in study of God's word, and let God be the warrior. And so here, when they asked for a king to be their warrior, like all the nations, verse 20 says the people refused to obey. Verse 19, the voice of Samuel, they said, not only there shall be a king over us, that we may also be like the nations, that our king may judge us, and that he may go out before us and fight our battles. And that tips their hand as to what they were actually wanting, and that's the rejection of Yahweh as their warrior. So that's the problem. But God says, go ahead and do it. Tell Samuel to do that. So they chooses Saul. Saul is the epitome of the great warrior. He's head and shoulders above everybody else, and so on. And so he's established as king, but there are problems. And Saul, 2 different times, chapter 13, chapter 15, in a sense, shoots himself in the foot and does the wrong things. And Samuel comes to him in chapter 13 and just says, particularly in verse 13, and he says, after Saul has offered wrong sacrifice, Samuel says, you have done foolishly, you have not kept the command of the Lord your God with which he commanded you, for then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now it's going to be ripped away. So the kingship is then transferred to David, chapter 16. You have Samuel finds David in his father's household, anoints him there. David is anointed 3 times as king, once in chapter 16, over his own family, in his presence of his own family. Second time in 2 Samuel chapter 2, where he's anointed over his own tribe of Judah. And then finally, the climactic point in David's career in 2 Samuel 5, the first 5 verses, where he's anointed over all Israel. And so he's now in chapter 5, his career is kind of established. So the next 6 verses or so, 5 verses, 2 Samuel 5, verses 6 to 10, show David capturing Jerusalem. And then the next chapter is kind of show him consolidating his power. So if I were to trace the trajectory of David's life, I would see sort of the idea of David's rise from 1 Samuel 16 all the way to 2 Samuel 5. There's a period of consolidation of power in chapters 5 through 10, roughly. And then 2 Samuel 11 is the great scene with Bathsheba and the consequences of that. 2 Samuel 12 is Nathan the prophet confronting him, and he goes down. After that, everything goes downhill. You have David's children rebelling against him and causing all kinds of problems. You have other issues, and by the end of his life, things have not worked out really well. So that kind of shows some of the consequences of sin that we'll mention in a different context.